Good morning, all, and welcome to this online event co-hosted by the Center for Naval Analyses and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'd like to start with some housekeeping notes before we dive into a great planned discussion. My name is Dr. Joshua Tallis. I'm a research scientist in CNA's Strategy and Policy Analysis program, where I lead the Arctic Strategy portfolio. Broadly, our CNA team studies issues relating to national and maritime strategy and provides functional looks at strategic issues such as alliance management, nuclear policy, and non-traditional challenges. Our partner today, IISS, is an international research institute with offices in London, Berlin, Manama, Singapore, and Washington, D.C. They're known for trusted information and analysis that reflects the motto, facts, analysis, influence. IISS provides its analytic expertise to inform government and industry in order to improve public policymaking. This joint webinar represents a collaboration to particularly draw the attention of IISS members to a region, the Arctic, that remains a mystery for many who don't closely follow it. Our panelists, whom I'll introduce momentarily, draw from the strengths of both of our organizations as well as our valued partnerships with outside voices. It marks a collaboration that both IISS and CNA look forward to expanding. And speaking of collaboration, we welcome your participation in this discussion, which will be recorded and available for later sharing. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom taskbar to submit questions for the panel. In the next hour, our panelists and I will discuss the Arctic with a focus on some of the core ways the region is reshaping global strategic considerations. These include the expanding navigability of Arctic sea lanes, the growing interest of non-Arctic nations in regional resources, and the ever-present questions of competition among major powers. I am joined for this conversation by three wonderful panelists. Mr. Nick Childs is the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security at IISS, and previously held numerous posts with the BBC, including correspondent for World Affairs, Defense, and at the Pentagon. Vice Admiral John Miller is an Associate Fellow at IISS. He retired from the United States Navy, serving as Commander, U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, U.S. Fifth Fleet, after a career as a naval flight officer, which included postings as a White House Fellow and Special Assistant to the NASA Administrator. And Dr. Rebecca Pincus is an assistant professor in the Strategic and Operational Research Department in the U.S. Naval War College's Center for Naval Warfare Studies, where she is also a member of the Institute for Future Warfare Studies. She previously served as the primary investigator at the U.S. Coast Guard Center for Arctic Study and Policy, which is located at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Thank you all for joining us today for a fun and hopefully enlightening conversation. As a matter of format, I'll turn to each panelist in turn for about 5 minutes of introductory remarks before we move into a moderated Q&A. And Nick, handing it over to you to start. Nick, it looks like you hit mute and then unmute simultaneously, so you're stuck on mute again.
Great. Timing is everything. But thanks, Joshua. Yes, I come at this issue from the perspective of the fact that the maritime domain generally is now a contested space and a complex space at the same time, thanks in significant part to the renewal of great power competition. And potentially there is a greater likelihood of confrontation between states manifesting at sea, at least initially, than at any time since the end of the Cold War. At the same time, it is also a potential arena for much greater global cooperation. And this is true when it comes to the Arctic, with some particular characteristics. As the invitation to the event stated, the Arctic is a region in transition. The chief drivers of change in this region are, one, climate change and the environment, leading, amongst other things, to the potential opening up of Arctic resources, and the related issue of the prospects, as you hinted, Joshua, for greater potential new sea routes. Secondly, there has been the renewal of frictions between the West and Russia, with the added factor also now of the arrival, in some ways, of China. This has led in some respects to talk even of the idea of a variation of the great game unfolding in the region. Clearly, there are numerous cross currents in all of this, which relate in a broad sense to issues of freedom of navigation, and they are connected in many ways. But because they are also discrete in many respects, this could and probably should suggest some different approaches to how and when they are addressed. So there has been much talk of the receding of sea ice, unlocking the commercial and economic opportunities, including new sea routes, but also of particularly Russian military infrastructure investments and the extent to which they are or are not defensive, to the re-emergence in significance of the Russian bastion concept for protecting its ballistic missile submarines, but also potentially to pose more conventional threats from within the Arctic or high north, as it is characterized to some extent for diplomatic and political reasons to sustain this degree of consensus and conceptualization out into the Atlantic and elsewhere around Europe. So there is, in this respect, an inside-out element which has states and interests within the region and states and stakes beyond the Arctic as well. The sea routes question presents particular friction points, notably resulting from Russia's claim in respect of the Northern Sea Route and Canada's, in the case of the Northwest Passage, that they include inland waters, in each case with all that implies with regards to rights of use and passage. Claims which are in varying respects challenged. And these issues can be represented as part of a wider picture as regards freedom of navigation issues globally. However, in practical terms, the impact of these is likely to be limited for a long time to come, given the real practical timelines involved in when there might be a real takeoff in the commercial exploitation of these routes. Of course, the incremental increases that have taken place in the use of these routes, which still might be described as being in the testing and experimentation stage, with a few score vessels using the routes annually to the thousands or tens of thousands of transits that pass through the Suez Canal or the Strait of Malacca each year, the argument can be made that this is a problem that should attempt to be managed over time rather than necessarily to be forced as part of a general trend at the moment. Of course, it could be argued that the testing phase is when one makes one's point, but the balance of risk and advantage, particularly given the options available, may suggest what is needed is a long game. This may be distinct from the geostrategic issues connected with the European or Euro-Atlantic Arctic or High North, and a Russian military modernization program that is now delivering revitalized capabilities, not least in the maritime space and centered on the Russian Northern Fleet, although admittedly not on the timeline originally advertised. Here, the operational imperative to assert freedom of navigation, or at least freedom of maneuver, may be rather more imperative in order to sustain a credible balance of deterrence. Hence, the deployments that we have seen recently in response, led by the United States, the deployment of an aircraft carrier into the Arctic Circle for the first time in decades, and of a surface ship group or groups into the Barents Sea after a similar, if not longer, absence, to demonstrate a willingness and ability to operate there and potentially to relearn the necessary skills and perhaps to evaluate the future operational requirements that might dictate changes in procurements and in order to be more effective in the future. Here too, balances have to be struck, given that all sides have potential interests to be weighed. I think as my time is up, I'll draw things to a close there and hand off. So thanks, Joshua.
Nick, thanks for some really critical opening framing remarks. Before I move on to the Admiral, some threads that may be worth picking up in the conversation. First, your introductory framing on the idea that the maritime is a space of both contestation and cooperation, is both sort of transparently true and I think uniquely so in the moment that we're moving into, right? When we're talking, we hear a lot about contestation over the rules-based order, shaping of norms, confrontation between great powers. A lot of that fundamentally happens in the open spaces left on the global, on the globe, right? These global commons. We're having these debates about conduct in cyberspace, space, the air, but it's particularly manifesting in sea. And I think it's notable because it draws a conversation in the Arctic into a much broader conversation about what does it mean to engage in competition in global commons. Your note on the inside out element, I'm sure, is something we'll come back to. And then this challenge of to what extent do you try and get ahead of problems you see coming down the pike versus perhaps creating some more friction and challenges now? Those I think are strategic concerns that I don't hear enough about in the debate. So appreciate those framing remarks. Vice Admiral Miller, over to you for your introductory 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Nick. Thanks for those opening remarks, and thanks to CNA and IISS for allowing me to participate, and to all of our participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. I have to begin with somewhat of an apology. I will tell you, I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the Arctic when I was on active duty. In fact, I had been retired for about a year, and that was participating in a Navy-led seminar, and a very senior Coast Guard officer opened up his remarks by saying, whatever it is you think about climate change or global warming, here's one fact you need to be aware of, and that's the fact that the Arctic ice is smaller now than it's ever been before. So NASA has been measuring the Arctic ice since the 70s. So we're in our 5th decade of collecting information, and the Arctic ice has shrunk. And obviously it gets larger in the winter and smaller in the summer, but it has shrunk on average of 13% a year. And so it's already opened up some sea routes, and it certainly has opened up the discussion. Some nations, the nations that are members of the Arctic Council, the 8 countries that border on the Arctic, understood way back in the mid-1990s that it was important to try to find ways to solve some of the issues that revolve around operating in what, even as it continues to grow smaller, there's very contested sea space and issues of transit passage or innocent passage, where you're going from one EEZ to another EEZ, or from international waters to an EEZ or to international waters. But during that transit, you're in somebody's territorial sea space. So there are conventions already, and I think someone will talk about UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea today. UNCLOS is designed to help us understand those, the rights of the mariners and the ability and access of the mariners. But there's also significant issues that revolve around the resources that we think are available in the Arctic Sea area, most of it underwater, but potentially as much as 30% of the undiscovered natural gas and oil, and over $1 trillion in rare earth minerals. Those resources are all things that will make the discussions about what's happening in the Arctic very robust discussions. And as Nick said, really long-term discussions. It's not likely that this summer everyone's going to get together and decide how this whole thing ought to go. So naturally, when there's economic interest, there's human interest in an area. The nations that are most interested are very likely to beef up their military capabilities, and certainly we're seeing that already. And Marion, if you can just put the slide up for a moment. Okay, this is obviously a depiction of the Arctic, and what you see in the pink and in the brown are indications of Russian military construction, military modernization and improvements, and that includes this small island that seems to be midway between Greenland and Russia. That has been modernized as an air base that can take jet fighters. The Northern Fleet of Russia is about to receive new jet fighters and fighter bombers. So they're modernizing their capability all up and down their coast, and then out into the Arctic Sea, into a very small island that now is capable of taking virtually any aircraft in the Russian inventory. Okay, we can go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So the Russians are already engaged and involved, and in fact, they are in the process of constructing nuclear-powered icebreakers. And they have one. It's the Ivan. It's in service. It's operational, and they're building, we believe, at least 3 others. Interestingly enough, the Chinese have decided, okay, we need icebreakers. And the Russian icebreakers are some of the biggest ever built. The Chinese icebreakers are not yet operational, but they're larger than the Russian icebreakers. China is a observer to the Arctic Council, and they consider themselves, by their own words, to be a near Arctic country. And so by that definition, I think India could also consider itself a near Arctic country, and maybe Australia will throw in with that same sense. What is the United States doing? Well, we have some capability, largely based in Alaska. We operate more F-35s in that part of the world out of bases in Alaska than we do at any other single base. And so we've modernized in that regard. But presence is not necessarily always accomplished just by having aircraft that can fly over. It's a capability. It's a good capability, but it's not like being at sea. We have in our Coast Guard 2 icebreakers. They're both very old. The Polar Star is the one that's operational. And we really, if you talk to the Coast Guard, we have 1 icebreaker because you use parts from the other one to keep Polar Star up. Its last mission, like many of its missions, perhaps most of its missions, was down in Antarctica supporting the science mission down there. So it hasn't been present for some time up in the north. We are building a new icebreaker, and we have provisions to build an additional 3, which we desperately need. It's important, even as these passages in these new sea lanes open up, that you have icebreakers, because sometimes the ice isn't going to be sufficiently melted to allow a conventional ship to go through. So you oftentimes want icebreakers to lead the way, and especially given the treacherous weather conditions of the area, you need the ability to be able to form search and rescue missions, and icebreakers are essential to doing that. The first one we'll have available, the first new one, isn't available till 2024, and it's not clear that we'll have funding for any more down the road. So something for us to think about. Both Secretary Austin and the chairman testified recently before Congress. They talked about the Arctic strategy. It's good to know that the Navy and the Marine Corps in January published an Arctic strategy called the Blue Arctic, indicating less ice, more water. The Army has an Arctic strategy as well that they recently published. And this month, both the Marine Corps and the Army conducted operations within the Arctic Circle. I think that's mostly learning activity. It does have a deterrent effect, but we're really just starting to learn what capabilities do we need to maintain a sufficient enough presence in the Arctic in order to allow the processes that UNCLOS allows for, the discussions that will be held at the Arctic Council, so that we can peacefully understand which resources belong to which country, which sea lanes are in whose waters, how we really draw the EEZs, and how we draw the sea lanes and the responsibility for maintaining the sea lanes open. That said, we are on the right path. So when Secretary Austin and General Milley testified, what they said was, we need to invest more in the Arctic, but not right now. And what that indicates is we don't have sufficient resources to remain viable in great power competition in the Northern Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic, in the Western Pacific, to have some capability to keep an eye on what's happening in the Middle East and take on the Arctic. And so it is going to require additional resources. Not all of our Arleigh Burke destroyers can operate up there. They have to have their hulls reinforced at the bow so that they can do operations in the North Pacific and the North Atlantic. So plenty of work for us to do and lots for us to consider. And with that, I'll turn it back to Joshua.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Admiral. A lot of threads there as well. I think the two that I'd like to highlight as we get ready to move into our conversation is first, that point you made up front, which is a career in the United States Navy that didn't necessarily require a lot of attention to the Arctic. And I think that those learning experiences that you're talking to, and to some extent even potentially force architecture decisions that need to be made about what the force should look like going forward with an eye towards greater activity in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific and the Arctic, requires a lot more ground up learning. I was on Truman in 2018 when it went up to the Arctic. Was, Nick made reference to this ship as the first U.S. carrier to operate in the region in about 30 years. And there was, a lot of relearning and a lot of calling of graybeards in order to get a sense of what is it like to operate up there? Do we need to be worried about ice? Do we have to worry about de-icing the superstructure, things of that nature? There's just a lot of lost expertise that needs to be rebuilt. And then, Admiral, your second point, I think it's telling that you led with the question of resources, right? That to some extent, the military operational imperative in the Arctic partially follows on the growing expectation that there are resources for grabs in the region. And so there's a requirement to balance an operational and a strategic picture on one hand with questions of political economy. And that's complicated because I think DoD and a defense audience isn't necessarily used to thinking along those veins. So I'm getting excited for our conversation, but first I want to turn it over to Becca for her 5-minute introduction.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks, Josh, for the invitation. And our two previous speakers have given such great scene setters that I'll try to keep things quick. I just want to offer a couple of points. And I mean, in some ways, this might be seen as sort of an alternative perspective, but I do think that there's a couple things that often get left out of the conversation. And so the first point I want to offer is that the Arctic is big. A lot of people tend to forget that. It's a big ocean. It's about 5 times the size of the Mediterranean. It's about 1/5 the size of the Indian Ocean. It is a big place. And so I would argue that it's not useful to talk about the Arctic as a unitary place. It is too big for that. The Arctic Ocean is a big ocean. We understand that the Mediterranean has subregions that are very, very different, the East and the West Med. The Arctic is 5 times the size of the Mediterranean. So I think it's important to specify what areas we're talking about. So that's one quick point. A second one I want to offer is that the Arctic is governed. There are 8 sovereign states in the Arctic. There are virtually no land boundary disputes of any note. I'm going to leave Hans Island off the table. And most of the Arctic Ocean itself falls within the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, of these sovereign nations. EEZs go out 200 nautical miles. And so the entire ring around the Central Arctic Ocean is EEZ. And there are also virtually no maritime boundary disputes of note over EEZs in the Arctic Ocean. There is a small area of high seas in the Central Arctic. The Central Arctic Ocean is high seas, and so we understand how that is regulated under UNCLOS. And obviously there are overlapping claims to the extended continental shelf going out into the Central Arctic. And again, that is a process regulated under UNCLOS. Hopefully we'll get into that again later. But there are virtually no boundary disputes aside from the 2 straits issues, the internal water issues that both the Admiral and Nick mentioned. And again, we can talk about that more later. But for the whole, the Arctic is governed, and it is governed by stable, strong, and wealthy states. So there are strong states in the region that enforce and implement their sovereignty effectively. And so that's great. That's unlike many other parts of the world. And it means that when it comes to some of these issues, we should recognize that we have a stable platform of governance. That's my second point. And my third point is that the Arctic is dangerous. And the Admiral talked about that as well. There are a ton of operational hazards in the Arctic maritime, and climate change is to an extent making them worse. So the reduction in sea ice is creating much more unpredictable conditions, particularly in spring and fall. There's a lot of change going on that we do not understand yet, and that creates hazards. There's more floating ice than there used to be because the polar ice pack is breaking up, and floating ice is really, really dangerous. There's more storms than there used to be. And so there's a ton of hazards. And there's still the seasonality, right? The Arctic is still dark all winter long. It is still frozen all winter long. And so it is not suddenly transformed into this sort of balmy paradise where it's easy to drive ships around and drill for oil. It is a very hazardous place to operate in the maritime and on land. Thawing permafrost on land is creating tremendous engineering problems that are going to be a problem for infrastructure and development of all types. So to a certain extent, we shouldn't necessarily be thinking about climate change sparking access to the region. Climate change is creating, in some ways, more hazards. New technology is increasing our access to the region. States are building much stronger icebreakers. We are continuing to engineer better solutions for offshore oil development, for example. Technology is increasing our access to the region, and the warming is in some ways creating new and more dangerous hazards out there. It's still a very dangerous and very expensive place to operate. So I think that's important to recognize. And then the last point, I'll wrap up quickly because I do want to get to discussion. The Arctic is melting. And both the previous speakers mentioned this, the Arctic is warming faster than any other place on Earth. It's already at 2 degrees warming. And it's on track to be at 3 or 4, probably by the middle of the century. There'll be no more Arctic sea ice in the summertime. There's just an incredible amount of warming going on. And I think that's an important piece to recognize as we think about all of the hydrocarbons in the region, which the Admiral summarized. There's a lot of oil and gas and coal in the region. But if the world is going to meet Paris Accord goals, most of those hydrocarbons should stay in the ground. Obviously, one of the states in the region, 2 of the states in the region are not interested in that. But I think that's an important piece of this discussion because those green fields, the undeveloped Arctic resources, particularly the offshore ones, which are too expensive to access right now, are future resources. They're prospective. In 20 years, will we be drilling for oil in the Arctic? I don't know, but I think it's worth thinking about. So those were just a couple quick thoughts. There's a lot to unpack here, and so hopefully we'll get some questions in. I'm going to wrap up here, and it's a great panel, so I'm looking forward to seeing what the questions are. Thanks so much.
That's fantastic, Becca. That's a masterclass, and I think a lot of issues that don't come up enough in Arctic conversations. And maybe we can use this as an opportunity to differentiate this panel from the so many Arctic discussions that are taking place, including several today. And so as a recap, your point that the Arctic is not one place I think is critical, and I think links back with something that Admiral Miller had mentioned, which is, for example, the large concentration of Joint Strike Fighters in Alaska, right? Because and this is a bit of a caricature, but the predominant way that the United States thinks about threats and concerns in that part of the Arctic is predominantly an aerospace threat, right? This is about homeland defense, and this is about deterring acts of aggression by air-breathing threats, so to speak, coming over the poles from Russia. Whereas in the North Atlantic, it is much more a subsurface threat and a more conventional maritime one. Again, a little bit of a caricature, but does speak to that point that the Arctic is not one place, and even at the operational level, that means potentially a different type of posture and a different presence format. My card's on the table about your point about the Arctic is governed. I wrote a piece for War on the Rocks, maybe a week ago that makes a very similar point that if we look at the Arctic only in its own context, it can seem perhaps like more of a basket case than it really is. It is an overwhelmingly managed region. And what really then that calls us to do is to have a much better understanding, like I think the Admiral mentioned and Nick as well. What do those structures mean? How do they shape decision making? Where might there be gaps? And how can we understand what those gaps mean from a much more nuanced standpoint? And so, Becca, you mentioned that, there really aren't a whole lot of meaningful disputes in the region. And just to sort of lay it out for folks, there are 2 sort of territorial disputes that are bilateral in nature. There's Hans Island, which, as you noted, is basically a non-issue, right? If you're exchanging schnapps, twice a year, then this is not a sort of thing that's really a stick in the craw for Canada and Denmark. And then there's Beaufort Sea, which is a disagreement that stems all the way back from an 1825 agreement between the British Empire and the Russians, now between the United States and Canada, which is not exactly a non-issue, but I think there's no real concerns that the United States and Canada are going to war over this. There are two that relate more towards maritime traffic, which I think is where we're going to steer the conversation in a little bit, and that's with respect to Northwest Passage. Nick made this point about the Canadian claim, and then the Northern Sea Route, which is something that the Admiral mentioned. And then, of course, there's this element about continental shelf extensions and sort of a dispute over the North Pole, which is really largely still being managed within the confines, Becca and the Admiral, as you both noted, within the confines of existing institutions. And so that, I think, is a really critical framing for how we understand the region. You know, we're starting to get some questions coming over Q&A, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and start with what I hope can be a little bit of a hot button issue for conversation, which is the question of FONOPS, right? We're focusing on the Arctic as a maritime arena. We've introduced this panel in part over one that talks about navigability and territoriality and things of those nature. And the United States, and in particular the US Navy, one of its biggest hammers is the ability to conduct freedom of navigation operations. And so first, Nick, I want to steer this initially towards you and then pivot towards the Admiral and to Becca. And I've got a two-parter on this. The first is, whenever someone says freedom of navigation, there's an instinct to think about US activities around the world. And I'm thinking in particular the South China Sea. And to me, that begs the question, and Nick, this is something that you hinted out in your opening, you know, how similar or dissimilar do you see Arctic maritime questions and things like territoriality and contestations with respect to rule of law? How different or dissimilar do you see the Arctic maritime questions to those that the US faces in other parts of the world? And then with that, I'll circle back to Becca and the Admiral in a bit.
Thank you, Joshua. Well, I mean, there is continuity and connection all over the place, but there are also distinctions. And I think that was the point I was trying to make. And certainly as far as the Arctic is concerned, there are characteristics which may change the game to some extent. In a sense, there are some very general approaches that we've seen around the world, led by the United States, as you say, the freedom of navigation operations, where, you know, apart from anything else, consistency and, if not persistent, then regular presence is part of the toolkit, if you like. And then on top of that, particularly in the context of things like the South China Sea, embracing others and making it something that is not just about the United States versus whoever, is part of the issue. In the Arctic, those are all challenging questions. There are the dynamics within the Arctic, and to some extent, the United States is more a direct party than in other respects. The dynamics of the Arctic players versus the non-Arctic players are a challenge. And then there are the simple practical problems of, as I was saying, at least part of the value of freedom of navigation operations is their persistence. And if, as the Admiral was pointing out, you don't have the wherewithal necessarily to go where you want just in terms of ship design, but also in terms of ship numbers, that becomes challenging. So maybe the answers are different, or at least on a different timescale to a different pattern than we see elsewhere. And on top of that, there are the questions around what are the strategic issues involved, particularly in things like the sea routes, and what are more sort of commercial and maritime security issues that could be managed in a different way. So I think there are distinctions there.
Yeah, that's a good point. The idea that it is a tool isn't necessarily the right tool to meet the specific challenge. You know, perhaps that's something, Becca, I'll turn to you next. Should the United States conduct a FONOP in the Arctic?
So first, I will preface my answer by noting that while I am an employee of the United States Navy, I am speaking with you all today in a personal capacity. And so I am not going to offer the official position of the Naval War College or the Navy or the DoD. So, you know, again, in my personal capacity, I do not think that a FONOP in the Arctic is a high priority right now. I think there are some pretty significant risks associated with an operation. And just to kind of summarize quickly, there are two sort of contested ship routes in the Arctic. So the Northwest Passage runs along Canada's northern coastline, and then the Northern Sea Route runs along Russia's northern sea line. And both Canada and Russia have drawn straight baselines around archipelagos along those routes, and they've enclosed those shipping lanes and declared that they are internal waters. And they justify that on fairly similar bases. So they both point to historic use, and they say, look, no one has been using these straits for international ship traffic. That's because they were frozen. And there is some debate about the historic use there. There's legal cases about it. And then there's second grounds for this justification is Article 234 of UNCLOS, which affords special protections for ice-covered waters. And it's environmental protection, and it points to the presence of sea ice. And again, that basis is also being undermined rapidly by global warming. And so they make very similar claims, and they've done relatively similar sort of constructs here. And the United States disagrees with both of those. So I think it's important to think about FONOPs against either Canada or Russia being linked because of the similarity of those claims. So if you FONOP one or the other in the Arctic, you are sending a signal to the other party as well. Both channels would afford significant operational challenges, as the Admiral has noted. You would not want to conduct a FONOP without icebreaker support. The United States currently does not have reliable icebreaker support. So I think in the short run, it would be a bad idea to try to conduct a FONOP without an icebreaker. And I'm not sure that you would be able to find a state that would send an icebreaker. I don't think any of our friends in the region would send along an icebreaker to support us in that mission. I think that would create a lot of diplomatic problems. And so I don't think it's particularly feasible in the short run. And I think also it's important to recognize that for both Canada and Russia, Arctic sovereignty is a very sensitive political issue. So Secretary Spencer mentioned the possibility of an Arctic FONOP a couple of years ago when he was former Secretary of the Navy, and it immediately became an issue in the Canadian election that year, just the mention of it. The previous transits in 1988, the United States did essentially FONOP through the Northwest Passage, and it became a massive sort of bilateral political storm. In the 60s, the United States Coast Guard did some freedom of navigation-like operations in Russia, and it caused enormous diplomatic problems. So I think we should recognize that the cost will be high, and the challenges are significant. And so I think that's an important part of the calculus. And at least for now, I don't see it being a top priority. There are certainly, the FONOP program is global. We're obviously doing a lot in the South China Sea right now. And the United States conducts FONOPs against, allies and adversaries around the world every year. It wouldn't be my recommendation at the moment, but I'm open to other opinions. I'd love to hear from the Admiral on this.
Yeah, Becca, I'll just, drawing a line under what you just noted, right? The United States Coast Guard is conducting a cooperative transit of the Northwest Passage this summer, right, with the Canadians, which I think highlights the fact that while, technically the United States disagrees with Canada's interpretation over the territoriality of the Northwest Passage, there doesn't seem to be a pretty strong appetite anymore on our part to press that claim aggressively in the Canadian Arctic. And that does, I think, shape our understanding about the likelihood and the strategic likelihood or rationality behind a freedom of navigation operation. Admiral, I want to push it over to you, but with also a slightly more targeted question. There's a robust debate on the quote unquote icebreaker gap, and you spoke a little bit about that during your introduction. I think regardless of where people stand on that, we can all safely assume that one old and moderately functional vessel probably isn't ideal. And so I'm curious, whether we think an Arctic FONOP is the right approach or not. Icebreakers are prerequisites for operating in some parts of the Arctic, right? There are some parts of the Arctic that are predominantly ice-free. The high north, the European high north in particular, is one where US Navy surface vessels can operate basically year-round without concern for ice. But I'm curious about how you think about the needed force structure in order for the United States to establish the type of presence that you're arguing is needed in the region.
Well, thanks for the question. And I just want to start out by saying I agree with what Rebecca just talked about. And, I don't necessarily see a need for a FONOP just for the sake of conducting FONOPs. Now, we do this when I think of FONOPs, I think of disputed areas in the South China Sea and in the Pacific, where we sail through the Spratlys. It's, disputed. A number of countries lay claim on all or part of the Spratlys. And so we sail through there periodically just to keep fresh the idea that, you can transit from one point through territorial seas of a different nation, as long as you do it either conducting innocent passage or transit passage, both of which are allowed by UNCLOS. But I don't think, especially in the Arctic, there should be a desire to do a FONOP just for the sake of doing a FONOP. And this cooperative exercise that's scheduled for next year that you mentioned, Joshua, I think is a much better way for all of us to approach how we're going to transit through the Arctic. So if you look at the projections from the scientists, and I think Rebecca mentioned this, by about 2050, there is no ice in the summertime, but there still will be weather. And between now and 2050, let's say, there will be transit or sea lanes that are available for use, either around Canada, the Northeast Passage, or the Northern Passage around Russia, that has commercial ships saving a great deal of money, because that's the real beauty of being able to use that sea space. But there'll be a number of ships from a number of different countries that are going to make those transits. And it almost seems to me in the near term, sort of a convoy-like approach would be the preferred option. And a collective coalition approach from the Arctic Council states that have an icebreaker. So if an icebreaker is needed, it's there. There's an ability to do safety of life at sea, SOLAS missions. So if someone gets into trouble, and people will get into trouble, because as I think everyone has mentioned, it's, even though you can make it, through one of these passages in the summertime these days, it's still a very difficult transit. So rather than conduct a freedom of navigation operation, just for the sake of doing that, let's see how we can get commercial vessels going from point A to point B in a cooperative way with various different navies. By 2024, we will have really one icebreaker, and we just then decide, does that icebreaker go north and help out in the Arctic Ocean, or does it go south and continue to support the Antarctic science missions? I would say, as a country, we need a minimum of 4, 2 that we can put up north and 2 that we can put up south. If you have 2 of something, you really can guarantee yourself 1 of something. It's like the soft guys say, 1 is none, 2 is 1. So we're going to need that capacity, but we ought to continue to try to do it in a very transparent way, and in a way that includes coalition shipping, Arctic Circle nations shipping, so that everybody can see the benefit of just having the sea lanes open, safely protected, and successfully used.
Yeah, Admiral, I think it's instructive, your mention of SAR, search and rescue, because I think in many ways it's sort of the exemplar of cross-Arctic cooperation that doesn't just include the United States as allies and partners, but also includes Russia, right? Because there is this overriding concern in the region of disaster response and the ability to conduct search and rescue, which has been a fruitful area for cooperation and coordination. And that's my loose segue into 2, I would say ultimately separate, but I'm gonna relate them, questions that we're getting from participants, which is on this question of coordination. And one speaks to coordination with competitors, right? So this question, which is perennial in Arctic debates, which is it time to let Russia out of the penalty box and to engage in some more direct fashion with security dialogue between the Western Arctic nations and Russia in the region? This is something that came up in Lavrov's ministerial just recently, and it has come back to attention with Russia taking the lead over the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council, of course, doesn't include security issues, but it does provide a soft power podium for Russia to make a pitch for its renewed participation in something like an Arctic CHOD forum, Chiefs of Defense forum. And then relatedly on this question of coordination, and this is also a perennial item that comes up, is this idea of NATO in the Arctic. And I know, Becca, you've written a lot about this, and the question of NATO in the Arctic is polarizing, right? I mean, there is an extent to which Arctic nations see themselves as gatekeepers towards activities, norms, institutions, rules in the Arctic space. And even Arctic nations that are members of NATO are loath occasionally to open the door to NATO participation in the region. And then simultaneously, you have Southern NATO allies who don't necessarily want to have anything to do with yet another front that they may be responsible for participating in. So loosely under the rubric of countries getting along with each other, I'd invite your feedback both on the question of opening the aperture for a dialogue with Russia, and then in particular this question about setting aside the perhaps success of Trident Juncture, what is the right role and frequency of engagement between NATO as an institution and the Arctic region? And Admiral, I'll go back to you first, if you don't mind.
If I can't, I'll take that in two parts. I think we've got to be very cautious about how NATO operates in the north, in the high north, if you will, and I think we're better off making sure that the NATO role in that part of the world is limited to defending NATO nations that, for one reason or another, are under attack or under the threat of attack, which is why the Marines operate somewhat routinely these days in Norway. So I think that bringing NATO into it really complicates the issue, especially when you look at NATO expansion. There are some that still favor bringing Ukraine into NATO. So this just opens up another, I think, can of worms if we're not careful about how we do that. In terms of cooperation, it's I think, an important issue for us to delve into. And what I think our position should be is that we ought to cooperate with the Russians on things that we can cooperate on. So we're not in agreement with the Russian invasion and takeover of Crimea. We're not in agreement with Russian activities in the eastern Ukraine, and we're not going to be anytime soon. We're not in agreement with some of the bolder actions that they take when we have U.S. or Western warships in the Black Sea. So those are areas certainly worthy of discussion, but we're not necessarily going to agree. There's a lot to agree on in terms of what happens with the northern sea lanes, and it can be to the benefit of all of the countries. And so sitting down and talking about that, making sure that we understand, okay, during some part of this transit, you're going to be in either the Russian EEZ or perhaps even inside Russian territorial waters. But we have as Dr. Pincus mentioned at the beginning, we already have conventions for how to deal with that. And so it only becomes a point of contention if someone chooses to make it a point of contention. So I think a lot of transparency in what we're doing. And, if you have warships that accompany a number of merchant ships that are sailing through, one of them would best be an icebreaker, but the rest of them can be from different countries. And they're there to make sure that if someone gets into trouble, if there's a need for a search and rescue mission, that we can do that cooperatively. Interestingly enough, in the Arabian Gulf, if there's a fishing boat in trouble, and this happens quite routinely, there is already a set of protocols between the Gulf GCC countries and Iran about search and rescue efforts. And so it is not unusual for somebody from the GCC or from the U.S. Navy or from other Western Navy that's there. If there's a Iranian fishing boat on fire, someone will come to their rescue, and then turn all those sailors over back to the Iranian Coast Guard. And that, that's something that sailors have done for centuries. And it'll be even more important in a place like the Arctic that we're prepared to do that it doesn't matter who's in trouble. It's just that someone's in trouble and we have the ability to help them. And so in that regard, cooperation with the Russians is going to be key.
Thanks a lot, Admiral. And Becca, like I mentioned, I know you've written in particular on the role of NATO in the Arctic, and then this broader question of, where should security dialogue fit in the region? So if you have thoughts on that, you can contribute.
Sure, and I agree with what the Admiral said. That was a fantastic summary, so I won't add a lot. I think it's important to recognize that Russia would like to restart the Arctic CHODs or the Arctic Security Forces roundtables. Russian spokespeople have come out and said that very clearly, and so that would be a gift or a reward. Absent some kind of broader context, I'm not sure why the international community would unilaterally give Russia something that it wants, given that there has been no appreciable improvement in behavior in the last 6 years. So I think it's important to think about what we would expect in return for some kind of restarting, and absent some kind of two-way progress, I don't see any justification for that. I don't think there are urgent security issues that need to be diffused. We certainly have some concerns about the increasing tempo of operations in parts of the region where there is a chance for some sort of incident at sea. And so discussing some sort of INCSI agreement to make sure that forces can operate safely in the region, I think makes sense. As the Admiral said, that's something that's in our interest as well, but that is very limited. And it would not include all of the Arctic states because they're not all conducting operations in the region. It would probably include some states that are not Arctic, in fact, because we see the Brits, for example, operating in the high north pretty regularly these days. There are also other important areas of dialogue going on right now, like the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. I think that's an incredibly important organization that speaks directly to a lot of the issues that we've been discussing. That forum needs to be strengthened. It's very important. And then there's, a lot of Barents structures where Norway and Russia, for example, work together very closely on search and rescue and maritime traffic. I think that's important. There might be some interesting ways of broadening that dialogue a little bit. But I think sort of the overall, let's restart the Arctic CHODs, or let's create a brand new Arctic Security Forum. Again, I don't see the reason for that. I don't think it's a top priority for the United States right now. I think we have other top priorities. It's clearly something that Russia wants, so I'm not sure why we would do it unilaterally. And also right now, for the next 2 years, Russia is chairing the Arctic Council and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. They'll be hosting meetings in Russia. This comes at a time when there is a Russian election coming up in 2024. So we're already in a relatively diplomatically sensitive period. I think for the next 24 months, we should just sort of try to get through that with a minimum of disruption and not think about a whole lot of novel decisions and actions that could upset that fragile balance. Thanks.
No, I really appreciate that. Becca, that's, I think, an expert commentary on a few issues that don't necessarily get brought up, right? Because the recommendation for some sort of Arctic Security Dialogue Forum is perennial at this point, and I think it often leaves two things out, and both of which you mentioned. One is what's it taking place within a larger global strategic context, right? Not just specifically the United States relationship overall with Russia, although as you noted, that's important, but also just generally speaking, from a diplomatic standpoint, why offer a concession unilaterally if it's something a competitor clearly wants? And I think that's an important component. And then also, as you noted, there are operational questions of deconfliction and strategic questions of deconfliction. And those two things are not the same thing, and there are different mechanisms for addressing different levels of that. And so if your immediate concern is simply operational level management of maritime and airspace activities in the Arctic, there are means of doing so that don't require a ministerial level coordination. And I think that gets left out quite a bit. Nick, I want to convert this question over to you, but I also want to pivot it to some extent based on something that Becca noted, which is, right, these days when we talk about non-Arctic nations having Arctic interests, that debate usually gets clouded with this perspective of China's, I think admittedly absurd claim of being a near Arctic nation, and that tends to swallow the debate about the role of non-Arctic states in Arctic governing structures. But as Becca noted, the UK is among several Western states, and in particular Western US allies and partners who have a long historical heritage of operating in the High North in particular, and who see this space as at least a natural extension of their operating area. And so I'm curious about how you think about the role of non-Arctic allies and partners in participating in Arctic geopolitics and governance and operations.
Thanks, Joshua. Yes, no, I think, and this goes back to, as you say, the kind of inside-out element to it. I think there are particular perspectives that you see from some of these non-Arctic nations based, as you say, on their historical experiences. And I think the UK, for example, and France, as another example, a country that has actually conducted a transit, a freedom of navigation operation of some description in recent times through that area. Look at this in the context of their global view, if you like, and the issues around some of the global perspectives and ripple effects of all of this. I think from a security point of view, there are elements to this that there are, apart from anything else, questions of not so much security in the Arctic, but security issues that come out of the Arctic. And again, that is part of what do you do with NATO, and interestingly in that respect, of course, we just had a NATO summit, and there was won't they say something about the Arctic, and because of the difficulties they essentially didn't. I think the High North got referenced, but there are still challenges there, and I think what Admiral Miller said about in a NATO context, what you need to talk about is what is best for the direct defense of NATO members. So I think what we're possibly talking about are coalitions and coalitions of like-minded groups, which provide some sort of prospect of broader cooperation, and also some sort of acquiescence from those that are in the circle, as it were. The question of China is an interesting one, and again, it's another one of those where I think the debate has got rather ahead of the realities in lots of ways, particularly in terms of security. China may be one of those powers that for economic reasons will make that extra push in terms of investment in order to potentially exploit the High North sea routes, the northern sea routes, which interestingly will pose some important questions about what the long-term Chinese-Russian relationship is going to be. So all those dynamics are important. The one other thing I would throw into the picture, though, is I think there is the sense in which what happens in the Arctic is of more. Has stakes for more people than just the Arctic nations, are these, if you like, societal transformations that are going on in terms of attitudes towards climate change and the environment. And I think that is potentially where confidence building and cooperation on a broader scale is not only both possible, but will actually have to be pretty much mandatory in terms of actually dealing with some of these issues.
Yeah, Nick, something that I think we talk quite a bit about sort of projections and for climate change in the region, and I think understandably, because that's really shaping a lot of the dynamics in this space. But as Becca noted before, there's a technology component to this, right, which really shapes the extent to which extraction and operation in the region become economically feasible. But then to your point as well, there's a social factor here, right? The extent to which we are exhibiting interest in the Arctic region is partially driven by something that's not quite scientific. It's more about this organic political interest in countries, including in the United States, driving greater attention towards the activities and climate change in the region. And so there's a lot more than just looking at trend lines on ice melt, important as that is, to really getting a sense of overall as a political entity how important the Arctic is. We are running very close. In fact, technically, we're a little bit over time. So if I could indulge our participants and the audience for a quick around the horn, just 2 or 3 minutes to each participant as we wrap up. You are welcome to submit final thoughts, but I will offer this as perhaps our parting question, which is, what is the right level of focus to have on the Arctic region relative to other spaces? Admiral Miller, you mentioned that in Chairman Milley's testimony recently, there is the flat reality that as large as DoD's budget is, it is ultimately finite and constrained, and the United States has to make strategic choices as to where it wants to put its significant resources when thinking about defense issues, and to not make this exclusively U.S. focused. There's a British carrier strike group that is underway right now that is notably not near the UK, right? I mean, the UK is entering this sort of global Britain moment once again. And so our allies and partners are thinking globally as well, even those who in theory have the high north and the European Arctic at their back door. So I would submit for the panel as our final remarks, what is the right level of focus to have on the Arctic? And Admiral, I'll start with you again.
Thanks. I think we are going to, over time, and by over time, I'm talking about the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to have to increase our ability to operate in the Arctic, because the presence of U.S. Capable icebreakers, of U.S. warships capable of conducting ballistic missile defense, all of those things need to be considered, and we have to shape the force in a way that allows us to operate where in the world, in international waters, or on authorized sea lanes of communication that are through some other nation's EEZ or territorial water. We have to be able to operate in order to help secure the stability of that activity. So we can't leave it up to the Russians, or we can't leave it up to especially the Chinese. Chinese shipbuilding capacity today is larger, it's greater than the U.S. shipbuilding capacity at the height of World War II. So they have the ability, they commissioned on one day this last year, 3 different ships. So they're building a large blue water navy. They're building, as I mentioned earlier, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Nuclear-powered icebreakers. They're also building nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. But we have to have the ability to deter through our presence, and through the presence, I think it's best done as a coalition. So it's something that we used to do in NATO very well. Understand which nations have a niche capability, and encourage them to develop that niche capability, and do that in a coordinated fashion, so that we have the ability to ensure that the new sea routes that are opening up are stable and safe, and ships can safely transit through them. So we're past the time where we should be just thinking about this or writing it down a strategy. The Navy Marine Corps Blue Arctic Strategy was published in January of this year, so it's a relatively new thought. But we've got to be able to translate those strategic interests into a capability, whether it's U.S. or coalition capability, that provides the kind of security that typically Western naval presence provides.
Thanks, Admiral. And for those who haven't read the new Department of the Navy Arctic Strategy, talks quite directly about the need for presence, and I think offers some context to the Admiral's points. Nick, over to you for your closing thought.
Joshua, thank you. And I'll pick up the point that you made, particularly apropos of the UK, of the fact that there's a UK carrier strike group on its way to the Indo-Pacific region at the moment. It's only a few weeks ago that the IISS hosted this year's first Sea Lords Sea Power Conference on the back of a UK integrated review, which talked about a more dynamic and outward-looking and global Britain, but also in the context of the policy documents, talked about a UK carrier strike group deployment that was symbolic of that global Britain by deploying to the Indo-Pacific, but was at the same time also permanently at readiness for NATO. And so in a sense that, it was a case that there wasn't a choice, that it was all part of the same joined up picture. And the First Sea Lord's response, part of his response was of course that ships move, and you can deploy with impact from one theatre to another. But another one of the themes that came out, which the Admiral hinted at, was that given how diffuse all these challenges are in the maritime space now, and they are getting more diffuse and more challenging, the other key is partnerships in order to maintain presence and persistence. Partnerships and having the right capabilities to be able to not just interoperate, but to be interchangeable in some respects, maybe the high end ambition. So I think that is part of it. But in terms of the Arctic particularly, I think everyone will be getting more interested in it and more engaged in the Arctic over time. But as far as where the priorities are, I think certainly as far as the UK is concerned, as far as the Euro-Atlantic area is concerned, at least on the eastern side, that will probably be where the center of gravity for a lot of particularly maritime interests will be, because it is essentially still in particularly Europe's backyard, at least as far as the geostrategic questions around the European part of the Arctic is concerned.
No, great comments. And I think there's probably more work that needs to be done from a US strategy and policy perspective, and from those of other Arctic allies and partners, to get a better comfort level with how they can integrate European and UK capabilities without this overriding fear that it will mean some sort of crumbling of the Arctic order as we currently understand it, because cooperation does seem to be the name of the game for the region. Becca, over to you for final thoughts.
Thanks. And this has been a great panel. I'll try to make it really fast. When it comes to the question of sort of the Arctic as a priority, I would argue that the United States has three big problems right now: climate change, China, and Russia, and those are global problems. They also happen in the Arctic, but the Arctic is one manifestation of three global problems. And I think we should be focusing on those big problems. And solutions to those problems will flow down to the Arctic because they're global problems. But focusing on the Arctic and thinking that solutions are going to flow upwards, I think is backwards. I think that's putting air in a leaking tire. I think it's time to change the tire and focus on the broader underlying problems rather than on the region itself. Thanks.
Very succinct, and as I think you know, I'm in broad agreement that one could be particularly interested in the Arctic region while also maintaining some sense of perspective that the problems that the Arctic region faces are not necessarily unique to the region, nor are they necessarily the place where the resolutions are most likely to come forward. And so having a comfort level with speaking about the importance of the Arctic while understanding that issues that are global may require global solutions and not regional solutions, that's a tension that I think we're going to have to continue to take forward. With that, first and foremost, thank to all the participants for today. Thank you to the panelists for lending us your time and expertise. Thank you to the folks who lent questions. Apologies to those who submitted questions to which we didn't get, but hopefully we'll have other opportunities and forums for engaging with them. And in particular for me, a heartfelt thanks to IISS for letting me at CNA initiate our first joint event together. And I hope we have more opportunities to come. With that, I wish everybody a great afternoon.